Chelyabinsk Tractor Factory, Soviet Union, November 1982. Ivan Petrov clocked in at 7:58 a.m., 2 minutes before his shift officially began. He punched his card, nodded to the foreman, and walked slowly, very slowly, to his station on the assembly line. By 8:15, he had arranged his tools. By 8:30, he had smoked 2 cigarettes in the bathroom. By 9, he had inspected several tractor chassis that didn't need inspecting. By noon, he had produced exactly 0 usable work. His foreman, Dmitry Sokolov, watched this performance with practiced indifference. He made a note in his ledger. Petrov, 8 units completed, though both men knew no such units existed. At the end of the month, Petrov would receive 180 rubles, theoretically enough to buy a television set. In reality, his paycheck would sit in his pocket for weeks because there were no television sets to buy. The factory would report to Moscow that it had exceeded its production quota by 12%. Moscow would celebrate this triumph of socialist labor. And the entire Soviet economy would continue its slow-motion collapse, held together by a conspiracy of mutual deception so vast that it had become the only truth anyone knew. This wasn't laziness. This wasn't corruption in the traditional sense. This was something far more profound. An entire economic system that had evolved to prioritize the appearance of work over actual production, where the social contract between worker and state had deteriorated into a cynical game of pretend that everyone played because no one could afford to stop. The Soviet system wasn't supposed to work this way. When Lenin proclaimed in 1918 that he who does not work, neither shall he eat, the Bolsheviks envisioned a workers' paradise where labor itself would be transformed. The Soviet Constitution of 1936 declared work both a duty and a matter of honor for every able-bodied citizen. Stalin's propaganda posters showed muscular workers joyfully building the future, their faces radiant with purpose. The Soviet worker is the most productive worker in the world, declared Nikita Khrushchev in 1961, because he works for himself, for his society, not for capitalist exploiters. This wasn't mere propaganda. Soviet leadership genuinely believed their system would eventually outproduce the West. The planned economy, freed from the chaos of market competition, would rationally allocate resources and unleash unprecedented productivity. American observers in the 1950s took these claims seriously enough to worry. CIA assessments from 1957 projected Soviet GDP growth rates of 5 to 7% annually, compared to 3 to 4% in the United States. If these rates continue, one classified State Department memo warned, the Soviet economy will surpass American output by the 1980s. The Soviet leadership had reasons for confidence. They had industrialized a peasant economy in a single generation, survived the Nazi invasion, and built a nuclear arsenal that matched America's. Central planning had mobilized resources for massive projects: hydroelectric dams, new cities, the world's first satellite. Why wouldn't the same system deliver consumer prosperity? Workers, too, entered the post-war era with genuine enthusiasm. Valentina Tereshkova, who would become the first woman in space, started as a textile factory worker. "I believed in the dream of communism," she later recalled. "We all did. We thought we were building something new, something better." Surveys from the 1950s showed Soviet workers expressing pride in their labor, faith in the system's promises. But beneath this confidence, cracks were already forming. The very structure of Soviet economic planning contained a fatal flaw that would metastasize over 3 decades. It measured success by quantity, not quality, by output targets, not actual utility. Factory managers were judged solely on whether they met their assigned quotas. So many tons of steel, so many meters of fabric, so many tractors rolling off the line. Whether anyone needed those tractors, whether they actually worked, whether the steel could be used for anything. These questions were someone else's problem. The target was everything. This created perverse incentives from the start. The famous Soviet joke captured it perfectly. They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work. But in the 1950s, this was still mostly a joke. By the 1980s, it would become the most accurate description of the Soviet economy ever formulated. The rot began with Stalin's industrial mobilization in the 1930s. But its effects were initially masked by the system's crude effectiveness at building basic heavy industry. When your goal is simply producing more steel, more coal, more concrete, central planning works reasonably well. The problem emerged when the economy needed to produce more complex goods and respond to changing needs. Consider the evolution of Soviet factory management between 1950 and 1980. In 1950, if a factory manager received an order to produce 10,000 pairs of boots, he might actually try to produce 10,000 wearable boots. By 1965, he had learned that the quota specified weight, not wearability. So he produced boots with extra thick soles that met weight requirements, but fell apart after a week. By 1980, he didn't even pretend. He simply reported producing 10,000 boots, while actually making 3,000 and bribing the inspector to sign off on the phantom 7,000. This evolution had a name: pripiski, or padding the figures. What started as minor exaggeration became systematic falsification. And unlike in a market economy, where customer complaints would expose defective products, the Soviet system had no feedback mechanism. Factories didn't sell to customers. They shipped to other state enterprises or distribution centers. No one's job depended on customer satisfaction. The wage system compounded the problem. Soviet doctrine proclaimed, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his work." In practice, wages were rigidly fixed according to job categories established by central planners in Moscow. A lathe operator in Vladivostok earned the same as a lathe operator in Moscow, regardless of productivity, skill, or local conditions. More importantly, actually working hard earned you nothing. Gennady Gerasimov, who worked in a Leningrad steel mill in the 1960s, later explained, "I could work my ass off and produce twice what my lazy colleague did, and we'd get the same paycheck. Plus, my colleague would be fresh while I'd be exhausted. Who's the fool in that scenario?" The system offered no carrots, only sticks. And even the sticks became less effective over time. Getting fired was nearly impossible thanks to rigid labor protections. "They pretend to fire me, and I pretend to care," went another popular joke. The guaranteed employment that was supposed to be socialism's great achievement became a guarantee that bad workers would never face consequences. By the 1970s, chronic absenteeism plagued Soviet factories. Official statistics admitted to a 15% absence rate. But internal KGB reports put the real number closer to 30 to 40% when accounting for the workers who showed up but did nothing. The state responded with increasingly absurd measures. Working Saturdays, where attendance was mandatory and universally ignored. Socialist competitions between factories, with results entirely fabricated. And endless propaganda campaigns celebrating shock workers and labor heroes. The disconnect between propaganda and reality became surreal. Pravda would feature glowing stories about overachieving factories, while those same factories' workers stood in bread lines because their paychecks couldn't buy anything. Soviet television showed modern assembly lines, while actual factories used equipment from the 1930s that barely functioned. Leonid Brezhnev's economic policies in the 1970s made everything worse. He expanded the military-industrial complex, which absorbed the most skilled workers and best materials. Consumer goods factories got whatever was left: obsolete equipment, undertrained workers, substandard materials. and they were still expected to meet increasingly unrealistic quotas. This is when the social contract truly shattered. Workers noticed that party officials lived in special apartment buildings, shopped in special stores with actual goods, and sent their children to special schools. Meanwhile, the average worker earned 180 rubles per month, theoretically enough for a decent life, except that nothing was available to buy. The black market exploded. By 1980, up to 30% of all consumer transactions occurred through unofficial channels. Workers stole materials from their factories, a practice so common it had its own slang, Nissan, the carrier. Managers traded goods between factories through personal networks, bypassing the official distribution system entirely. The planned economy had become a fiction that everyone maintained while operating in a parallel economy no one acknowledged. The Kama River Truck Plant, August 1976. The moment when pretending became more valuable than producing can be pinpointed with unusual precision. The grand opening of the Kama River Truck Plant, or KamAZ, in August 1976. KamAZ was supposed to be the jewel of Soviet industrial achievement, the largest truck factory in the world, built with Western technology and Soviet ambition. Brezhnev himself came to Brezhnev. The city had been renamed in his honor, naturally, to inaugurate the facility. Western consultants had spent years designing the plant. The Soviet state had invested billions of rubles. The propaganda was spectacular. "The factory of the century," proclaimed Pravda. "Here, Soviet workers will produce 150,000 trucks annually, proving the superiority of socialist labor organization." The television cameras captured gleaming assembly lines, spotless factory floors, and smiling workers in pristine uniforms assembling massive KamAZ trucks. Behind the cameras, the reality was catastrophic. Yuri Brezhnev, the premier's son, who coincidentally held a management position at KamAZ despite zero manufacturing experience, later admitted in a rare, honest moment. "The opening was pure theater. We had maybe 40% of the equipment actually functioning. We borrowed trucks from other factories and drove them through our assembly line for the cameras." Vladimir Kozlov, a senior foreman at KamAZ, watched the charade with cynical fascination. "We knew the plant wasn't ready. Everyone knew. But the party had set the deadline, so we hit the deadline. On paper. In reality, we wouldn't produce a fully functional truck for another 9 months. The performance fooled exactly no one who mattered. Not the workers, not the managers, not even the party officials. But here's what made the KamAZ opening a turning point. Everyone pretended to be fooled, because admitting the truth would have exposed the entire system's dysfunction. Anatoly Chernyav, a senior Communist Party official who attended the ceremony, wrote in his private diary, "I watched Brezhnev give his speech praising Soviet labor and felt physically ill. He knew it was lies. We all knew. But we applauded anyway, because that's what we do. We applaud lies and call it truth. And the workers watch us applaud lies, and they go back to their factories and produce more lies, and we all pretend this is socialism." Within months, KamAZ's dysfunction became impossible to hide, even from the public. The trucks that did get produced broke down with stunning regularity. A 1977 Internal Ministry of Transport report found that the average KamAZ truck required major repairs after just 15,000 kilometers, about 1/10 the lifespan of equivalent Western trucks. But instead of fixing the problems, the system doubled down on pretense. Production quotas were met on paper while actual output stagnated. Quality control reports were fabricated. Workers who pointed out defects were told to mind their own business, or worse, accused of anti-Soviet attitudes. This created what economist Grigory Konin would later call the economy of fantasy figures. In 1981, he conducted a systematic analysis of Soviet economic statistics and discovered that reported industrial output exceeded actual output by approximately 300%. The entire planned economy was operating on numbers that bore almost no relationship to reality. The human toll was immediate and devastating. Viktor Granovsky, who worked at the Volgograd tractor factory in the late 1970s, remembered, "We stopped believing in anything. Not in communism, not in hard work, not in the future. Why work hard when the system rewards lying more than producing?" I watched men who'd fought in the Great Patriotic War, men who'd believed in Stalin and the motherland, turn into cynical thieves because that was the only rational response. The alcoholism crisis that gripped Soviet factories in the late 1970s and early 1980s wasn't merely a social problem. It was a logical response to an economy that had made honest labor meaningless. Workers drank because being drunk was more bearable than being sober in a system where effort had no relationship to reward. The wage crisis of 1981. If KamAZ revealed the production lie, the wage crisis of 1981 exposed the payment lie. Officially, Soviet workers earned stable wages that increased regularly according to 5-year plan targets. The average industrial wage in 1981 was 195 rubles per month, up from 180 rubles in 1975. A nice raise that would have been meaningful if it meant anything. It didn't. In January 1981, the Soviet government quietly admitted what everyone already knew. Chronic shortages had made the ruble essentially worthless for consumer goods. A confidential Politburo memo from that month, later leaked during Glasnost, stated bluntly, "The population possesses approximately 350 billion rubles in savings, with no corresponding goods available for purchase. We are, in effect, paying workers in currency that cannot be spent." The implications were staggering. Workers were showing up, or not showing up, to factories, going through the motions or not, and receiving regular paychecks. But those paychecks were backed by nothing. It was money that couldn't buy what people actually wanted: meat, cars, televisions, decent shoes, fresh vegetables. Olga Mikhailova, who worked in a textile factory in Ivanovo, captured the absurdity. "On the 15th of each month, I'd get my pay, 170 rubles. That was theoretically enough to buy a winter coat. But there were no winter coats in the stores. There hadn't been winter coats in stores for 2 years. So I'd take my 170 rubles and... what? Put them in a drawer? I couldn't even buy extra bread because the bread lines were already hours long. The money was meaningless. This created a bizarre inversion of Marx's labor theory of value. In capitalist economies, workers exchange labor for wages, then exchange wages for goods. In the Soviet Union by 1981, workers exchanged the appearance of labor for the appearance of wages, which could then be exchanged for nothing unless you had connections to the black market. The black market became the only real economy. A 1982 KGB report estimated that 40 to 60% of all meat, 30–40% of all vegetables, and 70–80% of all automobile parts moved through unofficial channels. Workers didn't work for wages. They worked for access. Access to factory goods they could steal and trade. Access to the supply networks that actually distributed real products. Access to the connections that made life bearable. Factory managers became kingpins in this shadow economy. They controlled access to their factory's output and could trade favors with other managers. A manager at a furniture factory could trade tables and chairs for car parts from an auto plant manager, who could trade those for construction materials from a building supply manager, who could trade those for furniture. The planned economy continued to exist on paper, while the real economy operated entirely outside it. The American misreading. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, American intelligence agencies fundamentally misunderstood the Soviet economy. CIA estimates consistently overestimated Soviet GDP, industrial capacity, and productivity. A classified 1982 CIA report concluded, Soviet GNP is approximately 55 to 60% of US GNP, with industrial output at roughly 70% of American levels. These figures were disastrously wrong. Post-Soviet analysis would later reveal the real numbers were closer to 35 to 40% of US GNP, with much of that concentrated in military production. The misunderstanding shaped American Cold War strategy. If the Soviet economy was 60% as large as America's, it could sustain the arms race indefinitely. This assumption drove massive U.S. military spending in the 1980s and created genuine fear that the Soviet Union might achieve strategic superiority. Meanwhile, Soviet workers were quite literally pretending to build the tanks and missiles that American intelligence analysts were counting. The T-80 tank production figures that worried Pentagon planners included hundreds of tanks that existed only in fabricated reports. Some American analysts did notice problems. Marshall Goldman, a CIA consultant, noted in a 1981 internal memo, Soviet factory output figures don't correlate with actual consumption patterns. Either Soviet citizens are hoarding unprecedented amounts of goods, or the production figures are fiction. His concerns were dismissed as overly pessimistic. The Soviet elite's response Soviet leadership wasn't blind to the crisis. They just had no idea how to fix it without dismantling the system itself. Yuri Andropov, who became General Secretary in 1982, launched an absurdly literal response. A campaign against workplace absenteeism that involved actual police raids on factories, movie theaters, and bathhouses during working hours. KGB agents would burst into these locations, check identification papers, and arrest workers who should have been on the job. In one infamous incident in January 1983, KGB officers raided a Moscow bathhouse at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday and found it packed with factory workers. But comrade, one worker reportedly protested, I was at the factory this morning. My foreman saw me. He counted me present. What does it matter if I'm actually there or here? The worker had accidentally articulated the system's core absurdity. Presence was documented, productivity wasn't measured, and actual work didn't matter. Andropov could arrest workers for not being physically present, but he couldn't make them actually work once they were there. Konstantin Chernenko, who followed Andropov in 1984, tried a different approach, raising wages without increasing goods production. This injected even more worthless rubles into an economy that already had too many. By 1985, Soviet citizens collectively held over 500 billion rubles in savings, representing purchasing power for goods that didn't exist. The workers' adaptation. Soviet workers, for their part, evolved increasingly sophisticated strategies for navigating the system. The storming tactic became universal. Factories would produce almost nothing for the first 25 days of the month, then frantically rush to meet quotas in the final days. This allowed workers to pace themselves, engage in side activities, like working on private projects using factory materials, and still technically meet monthly targets, at least on paper. Alexander Zinoviev, the dissident philosopher who worked in Soviet factories before emigrating, observed, the Soviet worker was perhaps the most skilled negotiator in world history. He negotiated with his foreman about how little work he could do. He negotiated with inspectors about what shoddy work was acceptable. He negotiated with supply managers about which materials he could steal. The only thing he never negotiated was actual productivity, because that would have violated the unspoken agreement. We pretend to work. You pretend to pay us. Networks of mutual protection emerged. Workers covered for each other's absences, foremen covered for workers, managers covered for foremen. Everyone had something to hide, so everyone had reason to maintain the conspiracy. One common tactic was the hero worker scheme. A factory would identify one or two workers who actually produced at high levels, then photograph and celebrate them for propaganda purposes while everyone else coasted. We called them sacrificial Stakhanovites, recalled Mikhail Gorbachev, not the future premier, but a machinist in Sverdlovsk. Guys who were dumb enough to work hard so the rest of us didn't have to. The technology gap. By the mid-1980s, the gap between Soviet propaganda and Soviet reality had become technologically obvious. When Apple introduced the Macintosh in 1984, Soviet factories were still using predominantly mechanical assembly equipment. Japanese factories had adopted industrial robots. Soviet factories relied on workers who were, as often as not, drunk. West German manufacturers were implementing computer-aided design. Soviet engineers still used slide rules. The Soviet response was to simply lie about it. Propaganda films showed modern Soviet factories that were actually Western factories with Russian voiceovers. A 1985 documentary about the automated Soviet electronics industry was later revealed to have been filmed entirely in an East German Siemens plant. But the workers knew. They could see that the tools they used were outdated, the materials substandard, the design specifications unrealistic, and they adjusted their behavior accordingly. Why maintain precision when the parts you're making will never be used anyway? Why work carefully when the quality control inspector is accepting literal garbage? The final breakdown. By 1985, the Soviet industrial economy had entered what economists would later call negative value-added production. The output of factories was literally worth less than the raw materials and energy inputs. A classified 1987 analysis by Soviet economist Nikolai Shmelev, conducted at Gorbachev's request, found that approximately 35% of Soviet industrial production created no economic value whatsoever. These factories would have improved the Soviet economy by shutting down. This was the logical endpoint of pretend work meeting pretend pay. Workers produced things nobody wanted, using materials that could have been used for something useful, consuming energy that was desperately needed elsewhere, all to create output that would be warehoused, ignored, or scrapped. Chernobyl Catastrophe, April 26, 1986. The ultimate cost of the pretend work economy became horrifyingly clear at 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, when Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. Chernobyl wasn't primarily a technical failure. It was a cultural failure that grew directly from the work-pretending economy. The reactor didn't explode because Soviet engineering was inferior. It exploded because Soviet workers and managers had spent decades learning that following procedures, reporting problems, and maintaining standards didn't matter. The immediate cause of the explosion was a safety test conducted recklessly, with multiple protocol violations. But those violations were only possible because of a culture where rules were suggestions, where supervisors signed off on procedures that weren't followed, where workers cut corners because cutting corners had never had consequences before. Grigory Medvedev, a chief engineer at Chernobyl who investigated the disaster, wrote, "For decades, we taught workers that pretending was more important than doing. We rewarded covering up problems rather than fixing them. We promoted managers who met targets on paper rather than managers who produced quality results. And then we were shocked when workers pretended a nuclear reactor was safe while actually disabling its safety systems. The Chernobyl disaster killed at least 31 people immediately and exposed millions to dangerous radiation. But more significantly, it revealed to the world, and more importantly, to Soviet citizens, that the entire Soviet system was built on pretense. Chernobyl couldn't be hidden or lied about. The radiation was detected in Sweden. The explosion was too large, too public, too catastrophic. The government's initial attempts at cover-up, remember, pretending was more important than fixing, made everything worse. when Mikhail Gorbachev went on television and admitted that a major accident had occurred. Millions of Soviet citizens reached the same conclusion. If they've been lying about this, they've been lying about everything. The statistical confession. In 1989, as the Soviet Union began its final collapse, Soviet economists published an extraordinary document. The Economy of the USSR, Summary and Recommendations, which finally admitted what everyone had known for years. The report's conclusions were devastating. Actual Soviet GDP in 1989 was approximately $1.2 trillion, less than half previous Western estimates, and roughly equivalent to Spain's economy, despite having triple the population. Industrial productivity had been declining in absolute terms since 1978. The average Soviet worker produced approximately 30 to 35% as much value as the average American worker. Up to 40% of reported industrial output was either statistical fiction or produced goods of no practical value. These numbers validated what Viktor Granovsky and millions of other workers had known all along. The entire economy was a performance, and they were the unwilling actors. The human cost. The pretend work economy didn't just hurt Soviet economic statistics. It destroyed human dignity and potential. Irina Ratushinskaya, a Soviet poet who spent years in labor camps, wrote, "The greatest cruelty of the Soviet system wasn't the political repression. It was the daily humiliation of meaningless labor. They took human beings capable of creation, of achievement, of purpose, and they forced them to pretend, to waste their lives in factories that produced nothing, for wages that bought nothing, in service of a future that everyone knew would never come." Consider the human capital destroyed. Soviet workers weren't lazy or incompetent by nature. They were highly educated, often technically skilled, and in previous generations had performed industrial miracles. The problem was the system actively punished competence and rewarded participation in collective deception. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, millions of workers found themselves with skills that were entirely useless in a market economy. Not because their technical skills were outdated, but because they had spent decades learning how to navigate a system based on pretense rather than production. The economic reality post-Soviet analysis revealed the true cost of the pretend work economy. The USSR in 1990 had approximately 120 million people in the workforce, industrial production that created negative value in approximately 35% of enterprises, an estimated 25 to 35 million workers who contributed essentially zero economic value to society. Infrastructure deterioration that would cost an estimated 300 to 400 billion to repair. A consumer goods sector that was roughly 40 years behind Western standards. The Brookings Institution calculated in 1992 that the Soviet Union in its final years was poorer than most Western analysts had believed possible for a superpower. The nuclear weapons were real, but the economy supporting them was largely fictional. Ivan Petrov, the worker we met in that Chelyabinsk factory in November 1982, survived the Soviet collapse. In 1993, his factory was privatized and immediately closed down. It turned out that the tractors his factory had been producing for decades were so poorly made that they had negative market value. It cost more to fix them than to buy new tractors from virtually anywhere else. Petrov found work as a security guard, earning in a month what his Soviet paycheck could theoretically buy in a week. But here's the thing. He could actually buy things with his new wages. Less money, but real money. "I don't miss the Soviet Union," he said in an interview in 1995. "But I miss believing in something. For 20 years, I went to that factory and pretended to work, and my managers pretended to value my work, and the state pretended to pay me fairly. We all knew it was pretend, but at least we were pretending together. Now nobody pretends about anything. and somehow that feels worse. This paradox, that collective illusion was psychologically easier than harsh truth, helps explain both why the Soviet system lasted as long as it did and why its collapse was so traumatic. The pretend work economy ultimately reveals something profound about the Cold War itself. The Soviet Union didn't lose because capitalism was morally superior or because Soviet workers were lazy. It lost because a system built on top-down control, rigid planning, and ideological certainty couldn't adapt to the complex realities of modern production. The United States won the Cold War not through military superiority or ideological purity, but through an economic system that, however imperfectly, tied effort to reward, production to compensation, and quality to survival. Workers in the West had selfish reasons to actually work. They got paid more if they produced more. They got fired if they consistently underperformed. And they could spend their wages on goods that actually existed. The Soviet social contract, lifelong employment, guaranteed wages, comprehensive social services, was supposed to free workers from capitalist exploitation. Instead, it freed them from any incentive to contribute. The very securities that were meant to liberate workers ended up imprisoning them in a system of mutual pretense that served nobody. The legacy continues. Russia today struggles with corruption and institutional distrust that grew directly from the pretend work economy. When 3 generations learn that official statistics are lies, official procedures are theater, and official promises are meaningless, you don't rebuild trust quickly. The greatest irony is that Marx himself would have recognized the problem. He wrote extensively about alienated labor under capitalism. Workers disconnected from the products of their work, treated as cogs in a machine. But Soviet-style socialism created an even more complete alienation. Workers disconnected not just from their products, but from the entire concept that their labor mattered at all. Back in that Chelyabinsk factory in November 1982, Ivan Petrov was performing a complex economic calculation without realizing it. He knew that working hard would earn him nothing, that following the rules would get him nothing, that producing quality goods would accomplish nothing. So he didn't. He pretended to work, just as his bosses pretended to pay him, just as the state pretended the system functioned. And in that moment of mutual pretense, in millions of similar moments across thousands of Soviet factories, the Cold War's outcome was being determined, not by missiles or spies or summits, but by a simple truth that no amount of propaganda could conceal. An economy based on lies eventually runs out of things to lie about.